today, two people from Fairchild. We have our representative who contacts us whenever there are new listings and so on, Stacy, who's in the back. Stand up and say hello. And then our speaker today is Amanda Recchia. That's right? Okay. She does have a background in textiles. She went to West Virginia University and, although not a textiles major, minored in textiles and took some of the same types of classes that you are taking. She had Nora McDonald for a professor. So that's interesting. That's a colleague that we share in common. So they will be talking about what Fairchild Books is doing on the digital textbook front.
Dr. Walters. Appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to get to see all of your faces. I work so much on books, and I very rarely get to actually interact with students or see students, so this is a real treat for me. Thank you. So I'm curious, how many of you have Googled something today? Show of hands. Okay, good. How many of you have read a style website or blog today? Okay, good. And how many of you have read a textbook today? That's great. Oh, good. We've got 6 people. Good. So the reason I'm asking that is, one question that I get asked a lot as a publisher is, why do we need books when there's the internet? Isn't all of that information just out there in the world? And my answer to that typically is that information has value, but the right information has enormous value. Throughout history, we've sort of lived in an economy that's had a scarcity of information. So being able to trade information, being able to share information about where to find things, how to do things has always had a lot of value. In the last few years, more than a few years, I guess in the last decade or so, we really moved into an information-rich economy. So really, to me what that means is that it takes a little more parsing out to find the information that you need. So according to Eric Schmidt at Google, every 2 days now, the human race creates as much information as we did from the dawn of time until 2003. So it's every 2 days we're doing that. So that's a lot of information out there in the world. So how do you find the information that you need to be successful? Really the challenge is really not finding a scarce plant growing in a desert. It's finding a very specific plant growing in a jungle. And what I see as the role of publishers is helping readers and helping students find that specific plant. So that rare gem, that little piece of information, that's going to make the difference. When it comes to fashion specifically, we have really high expectations. So I'm curious, maybe you guys can just shout them out. What are some of your favorite websites or blogs? Style Report? The Zoe Report? Okay. Anyone else? Maybe Vogue.com or, yes?
I love the business and fashion.
Oh, the business, yeah, me too. It's really easy to read. And so, some of the things that we expect from fashion publications, we expect them to be current, we expect them to be fast, we expect them to keep pace with the industry, we expect them to be interesting, and more than anything, we expect them to be visual, and we expect them to be beautiful. So in fashion publishing, these are the types of things that we keep in mind when we're creating books and we're creating publications, is really hitting the mark and making sure that we're publishing works that meet the high standards of fashion. So I'm hoping that you guys are wondering, how do books get published? I would say the short answer to that is through me. My role as an acquisitions editor is really to be the first point of contact for an author who's interested in writing a book. I'm sort of the person in charge of taking an idea and turning it into a product. So whether that product is a physical book, something whether it's a digital product, meaning an ebook, or a platform that houses information. The acquisitions editor's role is to take an idea, flesh it out into a proposal, turn that into a plan, and then sort of get the wheels in motion so that it can move through the publishing process. Before I get into the publishing process, I guess I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself and about Bloomsbury Publishing. As Dr. Welter said, I started out as an English major. I minored in textiles, apparel, and merchandising. I always had a strong interest in fashion and an interest in textiles, but writing was a little bit more of my strong suit. I wasn't a very good illustrator, and I'm very bad at math. So I decided not to be a pattern maker or a retailer. Instead, I went into book publishing. I've been working for Fairchild Books for about 7 years this March. So I've been doing this for a little while. And even in just the short time, relatively short time that I've been working in this industry, things have changed dramatically. When I first started out, we weren't publishing any ebooks, and ebooks in general were really just starting to pop up on the scene. At the time, I think there really wasn't there weren't a lot of tablets, and students were occasionally accessing ebooks on their computers, but there really wasn't one device that sort of won the market. I think what's really been a game changer, at least in the past 5 years, is that there are so many different devices out there on which you can read. And another thing that I'm asked quite often is, are people still buying books, basically? And the answer is yes. And one of the opportunities really that I see with e-publishing and with digital publishing is to open up the market to readers. So, this really applies a little bit more to the trade side than the academic side, but people who buy ebooks love to read. And for them, it's not an either-or situation. They're not, not buying physical copies of books anymore. They just want to be able to read books anytime, any place, and in any way that they possibly can. And to me, I see that as a huge opportunity, and I think it really reinforces the value of publishing and the value of books. So who is Bloomsbury Publishing? Bloomsbury is now the largest publisher of academic materials for visual arts in the world. That's been fact-checked. No, I'm kidding. But pretty much Bloomsbury Publishing started out as a UK-based trade publisher, meaning that they publish books for adults and children's, and all different types of genres, but not specifically designed for academics and for education. They were the original publishers of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I say Philosopher's Stone because that's what it was in England. The Sorcerer's Stone here, of course. That was mildly successful, so they got a little bit of money for that and decided to take that money and invest it back into the business. Bloomsbury is a publicly traded company, so what that means is that they basically report to their shareholders. And what I like about that is it really opens up transparency. You sort of always know what's happening in the company. And really their main mission is to support publishing and to be publishers. So now we have offices in London, New York, Sydney, and New Delhi. And we publish adult trade, children's books, and academic and professional. The visual arts division, which is where I work, is sort of comprised of different imprints that were acquired over about 5 years, starting with Berg Publisher. So in 2008, Berg became part of Bloomsbury Publishing. In 2012, Fairchild Books was acquired by Bloomsbury, and that same year, AVA, which is Applied Visual Arts Publishing, came into the folds. So what do we publish? We publish pretty much everything. Reference works, textbooks, monographs, journals, digital resources, some of which I'll sort of demonstrate for you today, And more we're moving into video and multimedia. So Fairchild Books has a slightly longer history than Bloomsbury Publishing. They were established just over 100 years ago. So it's a business that has been around a pretty long time. Originally, it was part of Fairchild Publications, which was started by John Fairchild, and was also the publisher of Women's Wear Daily, which is pretty much the fashion Bible, which up until, again, 2012 was part of Condé Nast Publications. So we sat in a division, sort of on the same floor actually, as Women's Wear Daily, for a number of years before moving over to Bloomsbury. Fairchild Books publishes outside of fashion as well. They do books on interior design and some books on general design. And we have a pretty long backlist of about 250 titles, fashion illustration, history, sewing, merchandising. What was actually sort of interesting about moving recently is we moved our book archive, and I held some books in my hands that were about 80, 90 years old, which was really interesting. We found a small box of women's gloves, actually, in one of our bookshelves from the 1920s, which was great. So I think in order to understand digital publishing, it helps to have sort of a basic understanding of book publishing. And in essence, when we talk about ebooks and we talk about digital publishing, we're sort of talking about content and form. We're talking about different ways to use the content and different forms that the content takes. So it doesn't really differ from the publishing process for books that much. And so what I'll do is I'll point out some of the moments where we do sort of diverge, and where things are different for digital than they are for print. Okay, so book publishing is made up of about 4 or 5 different departments. This changes a bit from publisher to publisher, but this is sort of the general breakdown. And it also sort of mirrors kind of the workflow that the book moves through. I mean, I would emphasize that none of these things are happening in silos. A lot of things are happening at the same time, and there's a lot of sort of lines that are blurred and interactions between the different departments. For example, sales and editorial. So Stacy's here with me today. She and I work closely together throughout the editorial process as, you know, I'm getting feedback from her about what customers are saying, for example, or about what books are really successful. So there's definitely a lot of collaboration. And I would say that publishing is very much a people business. It's a lot of talking to people, it's a lot of interaction with different departments. So in editorial, we really are focusing on really being the point of contact for the author and really taking a project and developing it into a finished book or a finished ebook. And I won't go through all of the roles, but just briefly, sort of the publisher sort of oversees the entire publishing program, so that might consist of different lists. For example, visual arts is fashion, interior design, graphic design, photography, animation. So a publisher will sort of oversee all of those different lists, and then the individual acquisitions editors will manage a single list. Development editors come on really in the manuscript process, so typically what people think of as an editor is someone who's sitting down and line editing or copy editing and really reading the material closely. That's a lot of what a development editor does. And for us, an art editor and a photo researcher are really, really integral to the process. They are working with us really early on, and sort of the people responsible for making the books beautiful, which is no small task. And then design and production really come in once the manuscript is completed, and I'll walk through those steps a little bit later. Marketing and sales handle a lot of the social media that we do now, so they manage our Facebook, our Twitter. They make sure that the information about our books is going out to the world and that our books are finding the customers that we want them to. And of course, the least sexy part of this is operation and finance, who they're very important because they make sure that our books are in the warehouse, they're in stock, they're going out in the mail, and then of course that our authors are being paid royalties on the books. So to talk a little bit about the editorial process. Any project really starts with a proposal, and this is really the place where an author and an editor outline where a book will be adopted. In academic publishing, we're really focusing on specific courses, so writing a book for a course, or oftentimes a topic, so an emerging topic that may not have a course, like sustainable fashion. So those projects typically don't have a set structure, and there's a little bit more flexibility. We're asking questions like, who's going to use this book, what need will it fill, and what's the most important objective of the book. Once a proposal's written, I will typically work with an author to refine a proposal to make sure that it's hitting on the organizational structure, the pedagogical features, the competition, and then it goes out for review. This is an opportunity for instructors who oftentimes are really your representatives to us to weigh in on the books and tell us what's working, what's not working, whether or not the information is useful, whether or not there's something better out there, and if ultimately they would actually want to use the book in one of their classes. We then go on and do market research, which involves a lot of competitive analysis, looking at existing books or products, and then we move on eventually to doing a budget, looking at the financials, and then laying out a schedule. At that point, if the author still wants to work on the project, which hopefully they do, they will get a contract for the book, and this is really sort of where we identify all of the rights. So who has them, and sort of what they mean. And then the most important part, the author begins writing, which, as we talked about, can sometimes take 6 months, can sometimes take a year. It really depends on the length of the work and the scope of the project. Eventually a manuscript is delivered, and at that point it goes through development, which is the editor that I mentioned before that's really working on the content, looking at things like accuracy and clarity, consistency. We have a house style, so we'll sort of check in against that. It goes back to review, we revise, 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 and then we really get photo research started. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the image research process, because I think that that's really one of the areas where our books are so different from the competition and perhaps from other textbooks that you're likely using in your other classes. I really imagine our art programs as being just as important as the text, and oftentimes when authors are writing, they're also specifying the art that should go in the book. So these things are really, they're married up together. Hopefully the text is talking about the images that you're seeing, and the captions are referring back to the book, and it's more than window dressing. The way that we acquire images for our books is typically through third parties. So this example here is Fairchild Photo Service, and this is actually the archive that our former company owns, Fairchild Fashion Media, that houses pretty much all of the images that appear in Women's Wear Daily. And then they have other parts of their service that house collections from the other brands or the other magazines, like Vogue or W. So on these sites, we can do a lot of different things. We can search by keyword, we can search by collection, designer. Some of the photo sites are a little bit more sophisticated in that you can search by, you can even search by color, you can search by material. So as the art editor is doing research, they're compiling everything into a light box. So this is sort of what you see on the left side of the page, is sort of a compilation of all the images, and then you can see it sort of blown up. of the editorial process is making sure that we have rights for all of these images. So pretty much all images and all text are protected by copyright. So if we want to reprint them in our books, we have to obtain permission from whoever owns the copyright. In this case, it's Condé Nast Publications, and so they'll grant us basically a license for the images on a per image rate, and those image rights change between print and digital. So in some instances, you might only need print rights, and that has a slightly different price tag attached to it than print plus digital. There's also a difference between US or English rights and world rights. So what I get asked a lot, especially pertaining to ebooks, is, well, why don't you just turn everything you have into ebooks? Why is that so complicated? And really the answer relates to whether or not, oftentimes relates to whether or not we have image rights for backlist titles. So starting in about 2011 or 2012, we started to acquire digital rights for all of the images in our books so that we could publish ebooks or publish them in an electronic format. Prior to that, it's sort of spotty. So we're going through kind of a massive project right now, digging into, literally physical files of books that we published, 8 or 10 years ago to figure out who owns the rights to the images in these books, going back to those rights holders, asking them for digital rights. So it's sort of a long process. And I tell you this only because it's not specific, it's not an issue that only I'm facing. This is something that a lot of publishers are dealing with right now when they want to digitize material. So in essence, we have rights to the text and not always the images. And you may have even, curious if anyone's come across an ebook where you see an image that's grayed out or blacked out. That's why. If you've ever wondered, it's because the publisher didn't have the rights to that image, or they decided that it was too expensive and they didn't want to pay for the rights for that image. So once the manuscript is more or less edited and the art program is complete, which means we have all the high-res image files, everything's labeled properly, it gets turned over to design and to production. At this point, again, we sort of start seeing a book in a form that looks familiar to you. Are there any graphic design majors here? Are any design majors? So this is where we typically start working with designers and graphic designers. Editors put together what's called a brief. So we do a page design brief and we do a cover design brief. And this is basically the main means of communication to designers, who oftentimes for us are based in London or based elsewhere in the world. They're not typically people that we meet or that I ever get to talk to. So the only way that I can tell them about the book and about what I want for the book is through a brief. And I think this is pretty standard for most design disciplines. So this is just an example of one of our interior designs. And here's a page design. So one thing that's happening in production and in design related to digital is that our books go through something called an XML workflow. And really what that is it's a way of tagging a manuscript and laying it out in InDesign that sort of embeds information in it that allows the file to be adapted later on into a digital format. So what we do is we basically take a manuscript, it goes through this XML process, and then the file that we get can then either go to a printer to be printed into a book, or it can be sent out to a platform to be turned into an ebook. This is sort of a new process for us and for most publishers. Again, so a lot of publishers digitizing their books are usually taking them and turning them into an ePDF. So that's it's a flat file. It doesn't really have any of the data in it that's going to allow it to function on different devices. So an ePDF won't work on a Kindle. So, so there's different sort of technical things that affect how ebooks can be used and where they can be used. So the format that we like to use, here's another page layout. I think it's pretty. Actually, I'm going to